This podcast is brought to you by Villanova University on iTunes U. Please visit us on itunes.villanova.edu.
All right, so I'd like to first start by thanking the organizers of this symposium. It's been a really, really interesting day. I also want to say that, so thanking them for inviting me and letting me participate in it. And I want to say that I have developed a cold, so if my voice gets kind of weird and thready, just bear with me. I've been doing that non-personalized medicine, which is cough syrup. All right, so I am going to talk about privacy and genomics today, and then afterwards we're going to have a more expanded ethics case study and discussion with several of us up here. So I'm really going to focus mostly on privacy. So when we think about genomics these days, and really I'm referring not just to the genome sciences, but to all the omic sciences, which are right now sort of characterized by being high throughput sciences to a large degree. That's almost synonymous with omic science, so proteomic, et cetera, metabolomic, transcriptomic. And so these are really being described more and more as a kind of data science. That is, it's not just the science at the bench, but ultimately the analysis and the knowledge generation is produced by computation on large data sets. And so when we talk about biomedical big data, we're talking about data which is large in quantity. Now, in the biomedical realm, we're into the terabyte, terabase, petabyte type of realm. We're not yet up there with the the fire hose Twitter feed, right? We're not at that space yet. But still, compared to doing biological science 2 decades ago, many orders of magnitude larger data sets. High velocity, which means the data are generated very quickly, and then highly heterogeneous. And just to give you some examples, by mid-2010, the Cancer Genome Atlas was producing approximately 7.3 terabases of DNA sequence per month, and researchers at the Wellcome Trust in the UK were producing more DNA sequence every 2 seconds than everybody in the world did during the first 5 years of the Human Genome Project. And in fact, people estimate that now, within less than a month, we produce more genetic data than we did in the entire 20th century. So when we think about sort of quantity and volume, that's giving you some examples of the increase in quantity and volume. And I'll talk about heterogeneity in a moment. And so with these kinds of massive increases in quantity, volume, and type, we need new computing architecture, new approaches, new algorithms and analytics to manage and then extract information and knowledge from. So one of the things about big data research is that people who do it think of it as there are patterns that are hidden in the big data, and the job of the analytics is to suck out information and knowledge by sucking out what is hidden within. And so here, when we talk about genome research, we're not just talking about the genotype or the DNA sequence from each person or the other molecular or omic data, but these days when we do genomic studies, we're also combining the molecular data with many, many other kinds of information and data. So it could involve sucking almost anything out of people's electronic health records, but other kinds of things that you might not imagine, like credit history. So there are actually 4 or 5 papers out there right now in very highly regarded journals using a combination of a person's credit history, their genetics, and possibly one other piece of information about that person to predict the person's risk of developing heart disease, right? So kinds of things you might not think of. Of course, information from personal tracking devices like Fitbits, which can be giving information about behaviors, about location and where people are going. And then particular information developed for research like interviews, responses to questionnaires. Also, people's web browsing history is being used in conjunction with genomic information. So just about anything you can think of is being combined with genomic information to do some kind of study these days. And so when we think about what are the privacy questions, what are the risks, what are the ethical concerns, what are the harms you might be trying to guard against. I think about this not only as what information is in a person's whole genome genotype or their whole exome sequence, but also what other information in the data set is associated with their molecular information, because these days it's always something. The minimal sort of amount is some demographic information and a diagnosis or phenotype, but that's the minimal, and we're starting to go far beyond that in terms of the kinds of data sets that we're working with. And so, although this is a talk about privacy, I am actually not going to really focus on privacy until about my 10th or 11th slide. The first thing I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the impetus for data sharing. And that impetus right now is very, very strong in the biomedical research community and the genomics community. In fact, the Human Genome Institute at NIH, in conjunction really with the Wellcome Trust in the UK, really these are the institutions that pushed this whole scientific community, kind of dragged the whole scientific community into an era of data sharing and into more and more open data and exchange of data among scientists. And the reason is because when you develop these enormous data sets, it's expensive to do it. There's a large investment of, in the US case, public funds, in the Wellcome Trust case, trust funds, right? But funds for which people's stewardship obligations suggest that we want to get the most out of that investment. And part of the way we do that when we create a huge big data set, we're not going to do it twice or 3 times. So what we want is lots of different scientists to be able to bring their analytical tools to bear on this data set, to bring their different questions to this data set, to perhaps merge this data set with other data to be able to ask new questions. So, and also, data sharing helps to prevent various kinds of fraud and misbehavior in these very, very complicated areas where it is actually quite difficult in the kind of complex data analytics that we're doing in big data biology these days. It's often difficult for peers to really critique or be able to identify when somebody may have been massaging their data or massaging the outcomes in their data. So data sharing is perhaps one check on that. So for a lot of reasons, the Genome Institute and increasingly other institutes at NIH and other funders around the country and around the world have become interested in pushing scientists to share data. And in fact, as part of the Human Genome Project, they developed a data sharing policy that required the DNA sequencing centers to share data almost as soon as it was generated. So to put it into the public within 24 hours, the final policy was they had to put it into the public within 24 hours after it was generated. And then they had a couple of weeks in which to work on it and do quality control and so forth. And then they put a more finalized version out into the public, right? This is pre-publication data. So for scientists, that's actually a real revolution. It's very risky. It means other people can work with your data and potentially scoop you in coming out with papers using your own data. Most data sharing, it doesn't involve pre-publication data sharing, but still this has been part of a larger move towards getting data out to other scientists who can use that. So part of that was this policy. So this is the most recent genomic data sharing policy for NIH. It was published in 2014. And more or less requires that scientists funded through NIH deposit some degree of individual genotype or DNA sequence data in a federally curated database or some equivalent database. The major one that we use is called dbGaP, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. This policy also allows the individual institutes at NIH to create additional or more sharing positive requirements on their funded projects. So this policy doesn't absolutely mandate that all individual level genetic and other information be put in a data sharing repository, but it permits the institutes to mandate that under particular funding calls, and they sometimes do. And this is just, it shows you some of the databases that are being used for data sharing, dbGaP being the one that has the sort of best developed and most publicly articulated governance structure. And EGA is the European equivalent. dbGaP and EGA actually mirror each other. So they've got almost identical data within them. And then some of the institutes have their own sharing repositories as well. So the other thing we've had in the US at NIH is the BD2K Initiative. So does anybody know what BD2K stands for? So that's Big Data to Knowledge. BD2K, it's as you can see up there, it's a trans NIH. It goes across all the NIH institutes. And it was established to basically promote data sharing and to promote the creation of databases in a way that they can be shared and they'll be most useful to other scientists. So there's specific requirements. I'm going to focus for a moment on the first two to facilitate the broad use of biomedical digital assets by making them discoverable, accessible, and citable. That's an exact quote. Then also to promote research to develop tools, and by tools they mean software that embodies certain analytical approaches to analyze biomedical big data, and then training scientists to do this, and developing a data ecosystem to support these activities. So that means investing in computational infrastructure and things like that. And in actually supporting and providing continuing support over time for databases. So now we're starting to get into the privacy issues, right? That there's a lot of benefit that funders see, and probably that research participants and sometimes patients see in having data used for biomedical research and reused and used by many scientists. But there are some tensions there as well, and the tensions have to do with protecting the interests of the people from whom the data came. And so we, of course, are concerned with minimizing informational harms to those people. We're concerned with respecting them and promise-keeping. And by promise-keeping, I mean in an explicitly research context where we initially obtained those data under an informed consent. If we told people that we were going to do something with their data and their biospecimens potentially, or we told them we were not going to do other things, then we should abide by those promises, right? And then, of course, everybody, and certainly people who explicitly choose to participate in biomedical research, they have interest in not experiencing informational harms, they have interest in being respected, but they and all the rest of us also have interest in advancing science. So how do we negotiate that tension, right, between making data widely available to scientists and minimizing informational harms and being respectful? So traditionally, we've done that using tools to anonymize or de-identify data. That's the traditional approach we've taken. So we've done that by stripping explicit identifiers from data sets. So explicit identifiers being names, medical record numbers, social security numbers, those things that are considered to be real unique identifiers and relatively easy, at least for some people, to connect to a particular individual. But nowadays, in the era of big data, it's not clear that we can distinguish types of data elements as identifiers or not identifiers. So I work with a lot of data scientists now, and every big data analytics research conference that I go to, somebody will stand up and say something to the effect of, you know, we can't talk about identifiers anymore because any piece of data or combination of data elements can identify you in the right context. The context being, what other information does an attacker have about you? What other data sets might they be able to combine with the research data set, right? What algorithms do they have access to? So that's all the context that can essentially make any piece of information or combination of pieces of information be identified. And there's the famous, almost I would say the birth of re-identification science as a science, when a woman used publicly available and supposedly de-identified medical records in the state of Massachusetts, and she used a birth date, a zip code, and one other piece of information, I don't remember what it was, to re-identify the governor of the state of Massachusetts. So Massachusetts had made a bunch of medical information publicly available to promote research, but this woman was able to re-identify the governor in, it took her less than a week to do it. And since then, there has been a whole science of re-identification attacks on data sets. So now most data scientists who work with particularly what we call high-dimensional data will say that you really can't anonymize it anymore, and we shouldn't be telling people that we can't. And so what do I mean by high-dimensional data? I mean data sets where for any person you have hundreds, thousands, millions of data elements pertaining to each individual person in the data set. So if you think of the person as each row represents one person, then the columns represent different pieces of data. You might have 3 million or 6 million columns for each row, right? That's a high-dimensional data set. And genomic data by itself is high-dimensional. When you add all the other things that come with omic data, it's very high-dimensional data. And so for the most part, I think people who work with these data don't really think that it's possible or that it's responsible to say that we can anonymize them anymore. So this important tool that we have had to protect people whose data we might use without their knowledge or consent, or people whose data we use in research, this important tool has been, its value has been substantially diminished. So what do we do instead is really the question that we have. Now I'm finally getting to privacy, right? So as I said, anonymity has been the tool that we've used. Anonymity is not coextensive with the concept of privacy. If nothing else, the concept of privacy is much larger than merely anonymity. And I actually think that there are some really important differences. And of course, this discussion about privacy of omic research data and data sets and privacy of medical information has to fit within a context of a much larger discussion that is going on in our society about information privacy generally. And I think this much larger conversation is actually pretty confused, in part because people haven't really thought about what they mean when they throw around this terminology of privacy. And so one of the reasons I think it's important to think about the distinction here is that although anonymity and privacy might protect a lot of the same interests and values, privacy at least connotes some limitation on who has access to data. The thing about anonymity is that if you think about anonymity in many contexts, what it does is it breaks the link between the person and the information in such a way that the information can actually go out pretty widely in the world. So if you think about anonymity and political speech and the importance of anonymity and political speech in our history, political speech, the point of it is that it goes out in the world and it has an impact, but by remaining anonymous, the possible responses to that speech do not come back and redound in a negative or dangerous way on the speaker. And it's been the same thing with specimens and data in biomedical research, that actually the value of anonymity is that we've been able to let all that stuff go out and travel and circulate among researchers without any of the information coming back to the person and having a negative impact on them. And so while privacy connotes sort of keeping things more limited, keeping access more limited, anonymity, the actual benefit of it is that people can be in public or let things go out into public without being harmed. On the other hand, when we think about privacy, of course, it's not just about secrets. There are a lot of different conceptions of privacy, both legally and philosophically, like the right to be left alone, the famous right to be left alone. And basically that's a sort of right to seclusion or to keep personal matters out of the public eye. And we can think that, yes, people with their medical information and the kind of information that we're using in genomic research, they may want some seclusion for some of that information, in some cases at least. I would say also there's a conception of information privacy that entails a right to control the use or transmission or retransmission of a person's information after it leaves the person's possession. That sort of assumes that it was ever in your possession, right? And a lot of the kind of information that is being used now and generated now was never exactly in my possession. I never exactly make a choice to hand it over. If it's a Fitbit or an Apple Watch, it's just being transmitted as I go about my daily life, right? I don't really make an explicit choice at some point knowing that this is data. To me, it's just my activities of daily life. And potentially genotype or sequence generated from a clinical specimen from me, that might actually get into research without me really knowing about it. And so I think a number of conceptions of privacy, privacy is valuable in those ways. In part, it's got an instrumental value. That's a lot of its purpose is instrumental. That is, it's to protect us from harms that might materialize if this information got into the wrong hands. But privacy can also have non-instrumental value. And I think maybe Anita Allen has tried to articulate this in some of her scholarship. So the idea that having privacy is part of being a fully realized individual, and in part that's because when we can choose with whom to share what, we are developing bonds of intimacy. We are actually creating our identity in relation to other people in this sharing process. And so if we don't have choices about what information about us to share, then we're somehow losing that ability to develop ourselves. So I think in the research ethics context, we are mostly concerned with privacy as an instrumental value, but it's not only an instrumental value, or it's not that to everybody. All right, so I kind of said this already, but so the reason we're losing anonymity as a tool is because high-dimensional data are intrinsically identifying. And so we don't have this distinction between identifiers that we can strip off and everything else. And this began to become apparent in the mid-2000s. I would say the Homer paper was the first paper that just sent a wave of panic through NIH and particularly the Genome Institute. So in that paper, what they did was they showed that if you had an aggregate of thousands of people's genotypes and you aggregated those data together, that they could still figure out that an individual person was in that aggregated data set. Now, those early attacks on the anonymized aggregated data required that the attacker actually have in their possession your genotype or sequence linked to your name. But eventually, we got to the place everybody figured we would get to, which is that you could actually re-identify somebody without ever having a copy of their own genotype linked to their name. So this was done in 2013. And if you are a male and you happen to have even a several degrees distant cousin who has put his genetic information into a genealogical database, then you are at risk of having your supposedly de-identified genetic information in a research database re-identified, along with everything else in that data set that might be connected to your genetic information. So the point here being that identifiability is a matter of degree and context. A person could be really pretty fully identifiable, or they could be really almost not identifiable in a data set, but that's not so true anymore. And for most of us, and for most data sets, things are somewhere in the middle. And so we actually need methods to calculate re-identification risk relating to particular data sets. and particular algorithms, and people are beginning to develop that. And so without anonymity or strong anonymity as a protection, the question is, what protections or combination of protections do we need? And I think most of us are coming to the conclusion that we need both technical protections and sort of policy/legal protections, as well as the development of professional norms among researchers and data users that will prevent them from doing unethical things with data. And so now, for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to just go through a few of those sort of I'm just going to mention what the technological approaches are, or some of them, and then talk a little bit about the policy approaches. So, of course, we need good data security whenever we are using people's sensitive data for research, right? That kind of goes without saying, and so that involves things like firewalls, encryption technology, authentication technology, but you can't always exactly have that. So one of the things I've learned, for instance, is that when you're working with very large, complicated data sets, and maybe a machine learning algorithm is working on the data, there are times when the algorithm is working on the data when maybe it has to get unencrypted for a moment, right? So even when you're doing the best you can with encryption technology, there are holes and there are risks, right? So it's not just going to be one answer, and it's not just going to be one kind of data security that we need for protection. We also have actual kinds of technical approaches to privacy. And there are a number of computational scientists who are working in this area right now who are coming up with some really creative things. I think David Page at University of Wisconsin and Matt Fredrickson are some people who have done this. Lucila Ono Machado at the University of San Diego, or at University of California, San Diego, has a big group of people and a number of different projects where they're working on different kinds of technical solutions or partial solutions to protecting the privacy and confidentiality and perhaps the anonymity to some extent of people who are in research data sets. So one approach might be, rather than sending the data all over or gathering data from lots of different places together to put them in one data set, you leave the data at their home institutions and you send the algorithms out to do some analysis at the home institution on the data, you know, sort of in place. And the algorithm comes out of each of those institutions with a kind of very summary analysis, and then it puts that all together at the end. So that's a technical solution that helps because the researchers themselves don't actually get their hands on data, right? All they do is see the results of an analysis. That can work for some kinds of research that we want to do. One of the reasons it doesn't always work is because when you have, for instance, a complicated machine learning algorithm, if the home institutions don't have a lot of compute power, it could take, you know, months to actually do the analysis, and that's just not going to be feasible. Or it might not work if they don't have enough compute power, right? Or if the data are kept in such different kinds of databases or different formats, then it's really hard to run this kind of distributed analysis. But these distributed analyses, Lucila has a number of different projects working on that. And for some kinds of research and some kinds of medical applications, that will be a good technical solution and a feasible technical solution at least. Another solution is to gather all the data together, put them in a very secure cloud, and then, again, you send the algorithm in to work in the cloud and the researcher never gets their hands on those data. The benefit of that is if you share data sets around and you have them at a lot of different researchers' institutions, well, it only takes one person to, for instance, save a large data set that was in a very firewall protected, segmented portion of a computer system onto an unprotected section of a computer system. So I had a researcher do that without realizing he had done it, and only realizing later that he had now made a data set with a lot of very private information accessible to anybody who could access the internet and was looking for these data, right? And it only takes one person to do that, and the more people who have access to the data set, the more likely you are to have some mistake like that. So if you can put the data set in the cloud and everybody sends their analysis in there and they don't get to download it to their own system, then that provides some kind of protection. Again, it will work for some things, but not for everything. And then there are other technical approaches that I will not take time talking about. I just want to say that there are a lot of really smart computer scientists who are working on this, right? Then we have policy approaches. So we have this kind of what I think of as so last century approach, which is called fair information privacy principles, or sometimes called fair information practices principles. Either way, it was an approach that was developed really to sort of apply to US government collection of personal data and use of personal data. It is instantiated, these principles are instantiated in a few laws from the 1970s that were really written in the 1970s in the US. And then they've carried over, they've been much more influential recently in Europe than they have been in the United States. And so the idea here is that a person should know what data are being collected about him or her and how the data are being used. So there should be a kind of transparency about this. And that translates practically into at least people should have notice about what data are being collected, for what purposes, by whom. And in some formulations of the principles, people should also be able to consent or not to this data collection. The collecting organization has an obligation to ensure that, oops, I left off a T there, the data are accurate and secure. And the collector has an obligation to collect only the information necessary to achieve its legitimate goals and to destroy data when they aren't needed anymore. So I don't know what it says about the fact that both of us have used the term epic fail, but I would say that in the 21st century, the FIPPs have been an epic fail for almost everything people are currently actually doing with data. And interestingly, this report, which is from PCAST, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, came out in 2014. There were actually two big sort of president advisory reports on information privacy. They don't focus entirely or only on the biomedical sciences, but the biomedical sciences were definitely a huge driver for both of these reports. But I actually like this one better. I think it's maybe more substantive. And they pretty much say the FIPPs were an epic fail. And among other things, they say that one of the conceptual problems of notice and consent is that it places the burden for protecting privacy on the individual whose data are being used, and create a non-level playing field between the organization collecting the data and the person from whom they came. And this is of course true in the commercial context. They also say, by the way, something which is totally true, which is notice. For notice to be detailed enough to really let people understand what you're doing with their data, it is way too detailed for them to mostly ever read it and understand it, which is absolutely true. And they just say it's a fantasy if you think people are reading these things and understanding them, and that's actually providing, as a matter of ethics or public policy, any kind of protection. And I think they're right about that, right? And so, and there are a lot of other problems with the FIPPs, some of which are pointed out in this report as well, like the point I made earlier that nowadays some of what we're using as research data is not the kind of thing that people know that they are generating as data when it is being generated or obtained by a user. And so this idea that you're going to get notice and consent, it's just not very useful. And in the biomedical context, for instance, I have a lot of scientists I work with, and they are trying to do things like write machine learning algorithms that will go through a combination of genomic information, medical record information, and maybe like medical imaging or some other kind of information, connect all that together and predict every single disease of any sort that any person in the data set is likely to develop in the next 5 years, all right? And so when they're doing that, they pretty much need to know everything that is in your medical record and everything that is in your genome. And they can't predict beforehand which pieces of information are going to be useful for their analysis. So the idea that you only collect the information that is necessary, that's not very helpful when the researcher looks at you and says, I need everything and I don't know what's going to be useful. And when my algorithm gets done, I might not know which pieces of information it used to make that prediction, right? So there are a lot of ways that the FIPPs were never followed and maybe aren't that helpful anymore. So what do we do instead? Well, first of all, we need some, I believe, actual public engagements and discussions with people to try and figure out what they care about, what they don't, and to help them understand how the research community is using their data in a variety of ways, what the value is, to try and figure out what some of the risks are. And then once we, come to some agreements, we need to actually develop governance systems for the use of data, governance systems so that we're not just depending on informed consent to take care of all of the ethical issues in research using omic and other biomedical and related data. And so when we're talking about governance, I use dbGaP as a bit of an example because I think it's actually an attempt to develop a governance system. It's not in any way the system I personally would have developed or recommended, but it's a serious attempt and it has some good features, including there are rules about, sort of what needs to be done with data in terms of de-identifying as much as possible and assessing what people believed would be done with their data and attaching that information to the data set before you put it in the repository. The repository does some quality evaluation to make sure that identifiers didn't accidentally get in there, which sometimes they do, right? Then there are rules about who can access the data, for what purpose, and what obligations they have. Some of those rules are just rules for data access, and some of them are implemented and tailored to the particular data set and the understandings that initially went with that data set, and they're tailored through contract between the data user researchers and the repository. And so it's an interesting model, and it's one model of at least attempting to develop a governance structure and not simply rely on, well, we got people's consent to do such and such, right? It includes penalties of various sorts for unauthorized sharing or use. We also need to create, I believe, accountable systems that automate privacy-aware logging and tracking of data use. We can attach to that things like, and if we're going to permit people to articulate preferences about what is done with research data, for instance, we can build that right into the data set. We can tag their data. It's being done in all kinds of other arenas. We can do it in research too. That kind of goes along with an idea of some sort of digital rights management, which makes a lot of my friends cringe whenever I say those words. But I think there are pretty simple things we could do to help scientists do the right thing. Because a lot of times when I've done some empirical research on how scientists use controlled data, a lot of times when they violate the rules, it's really kind of accidental. It's not that people have bad intentions, right? Finally, this is something that came out of the PCAST report. It's coming in from a number of different policy groups now. There should be legal penalties of various sorts, including, PCAST has said, criminal penalties for unauthorized re-identification of people in a research data set, right? So sometimes that might be authorized because we're trying to understand what kinds of re-identification attacks are possible. So we can't just rule out that sort of research. But for most research, there is no reason for somebody to try to re-identify an individual in a research data set, and we should make it very, very clear that people shouldn't even try. And then, although I've kind of denigrated informed consent a little bit, I think that there are new models that people are trying where we're not just thinking about consent, but ongoing engagement with research participants where they can access websites and potentially see what is being done with their data, who is using it for what studies, things like that. I think those are much better models. They're much more 21st century models. It's totally possible to do this kind of thing with web interfaces these days, and we should be doing that to the extent that we can. We also need way better ethical analysis and policy guidelines regarding the merging of different data sets, right? And so this happens in research and it happens outside of research, that people create huge additional value by taking two data sets that were initially generated for completely different purposes or for non-research purposes and merging them together with research data sets, including things like credit databases, right? And so we need to have some much clearer thinking about when it's okay to do that and under what circumstances it's okay to do that. And so far, people have just gone ahead and done it without any thought about possible ethics or ethical issues there. So I'm getting to my last slide here, which is that as much as there is huge promise and value in the omic sciences and the use of big data, I think there are also some real risks. And the two I'm going to talk about are very closely related. So one is a risk of exploitation. Now, there are lots of definitions of exploitation, and in the philosophical and ethical literature, there are whole very interesting books written about what counts as exploitation and what doesn't. I tend to borrow a little bit from Iris Marion Young, and so I'm just going to sort of think about exploitation where data users take the data, use it in ways that aggrandize political and economic power to themselves, and potentially physical control. And I think about physical control, particularly in the context where we're using data from from their interactions with the healthcare system, right? So where the user aggrandizes political and economic power and potentially physical control to themselves in some way at the expense of the people whose data are used. And so very closely related to this is actual disempowerment. So there's a huge rhetoric of empowerment around the use, the sort of know your genome, know yourself kind of thing. I am actually not convinced that the average person is finding or will find the kind of information they are getting or that is being generated or the ways in which we are using their data to be particularly empowering. And I think there's actually a really significant risk of disempowering people where we leave them feeling like we're just sort of sucking up information about them and they have very little choice about that, about what is taken, how it's used, or who uses it, so that they actually experience a loss of autonomy and a loss of social and economic status and potentially a loss of political status and ability to affect the political process. And so I actually find the empowerment discourse to be fascinating as a sociological matter and somewhat disturbing as an ethical matter. So I will thank you very much, and I don't know how much time we have left to answer questions.